hold on. And all right, we're seeing, can I get a thumbs up? We're seeing the right screen?
Yep,
Okay.
that's right.
All right, so thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here. When I learned that it was a journal club and there was a lot of persons with lived experience going to be part of it. Actually, I'll be honest, that was the hook for me, quite frankly. So, and I'm not just saying that to play to the audience. It's quite true. And so I'm really pleased to be here to talk to you about this particular article that I was lead author on, the necessary conditions of engagement for the therapeutic relationship in physiotherapy, an interpretive description study. Let me see. Okay, yeah, next slide. So a bit about me. Nothing professional yet, but yeah. So as we said, I'm in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I'm at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine. But in my life, I love my dog, my puppy Mia. I'm a dog lover. Mia turns 10 months old today. She's at doggy daycare right now, so I can't introduce you. But this is Mia, and I am in Edmonton, so I'm a lover of winter, actually, and like to be outdoors a lot, snowshoeing, cross-country skiing. And that's a picture, actually, a backdrop of our river valley in Edmonton. We have the second largest river valley in North America to the Hudson River. And so when you're in our river valley, you don't know that you're in the city. So I love that. Hockey fan, a Montreal Canadiens fan, huge Montreal Canadiens fan, and my partner and I love making pizza every Friday, our homemade pizza. So I'm a perfecter. I will say I make the best pizza sauce, and I'm claiming that, and you can't deny it. So that's me personally. And as I said, I'm at the University of Alberta, Faculty of Rehab Med. I'm an assistant teaching professor there. My portfolio is really kind of vast. I do impact assessment for the researchers that are in the crowd. You might cringe and go, "Oh no, ref." But I do impact assessment with our faculty in terms of teaching and learning and EDI, and I do some research impact assessment here as well, and I do research. So quite a vast portfolio. So I'm always happy to talk though about my research. And let's start doing that. So when we're talking about engagement, the conditions of engagement, we're really talking about relating. And I love this quote by Adler. He says that relating is an emergent self-organizing process. And when we're talking about the conditions of engagement, that's links to that idea of there are no algorithms when we're developing relationships, whether it's relationships in our personal lives or relationships with one another as patients or clinicians or researchers and patients as well. So the idea that we have to be able to adapt, we have to be able to respond, and how do we put ourselves in the best position to do that? So speaking to relationships are important, and certainly within physical therapy and within healthcare, we're learning that more and more. There's been a burgeoning of research around more therapy outside of psychology to more medical professions, allied health professions. But why are relationships important? Well, they're important because patients and therapists perceive they're important. And we're also learning more from the placebo and nocebo literature that the contextual effects, of which therapeutic relationship is one, can boost therapeutic responses. We're also starting to, certainly within within my area, physical therapy, start to think about ruptures or tensions to relationships. But certainly within psychology, this has been studied for decades, and that in psychology, they're related to poor clinical outcomes. So ruptures that have not been repaired, or tensions that haven't been repaired, are linked to worse outcomes. Within rehab, better quality relationships are associated with increased satisfaction, adherence. I don't like that term, but that's what they're using in this literature, as well as better clinical outcomes across many outcomes. So when I was doing my dissertation, and that's where this manuscript comes from, this article comes from, is one of the articles of from my dissertation. I'm a clinician. I'm a physical therapist by training, and I became really interested in therapeutic relationship when I started working more with people who were having struggles, and I ended up working in the workers' compensation system. And so there are lots of different types of challenges for individuals within that system. And I became very aware that therapeutic relationship, or the relationship that I had with the people that I was working with, was really important, especially within that system. And but what I also realized was that in physical therapy, we didn't have any literature on how, as physical therapists, we should be developing relationship. And so I went and did a professional training in a mindfulness and body-centered psychotherapy called Hakomi. I did training in the somatosensory treatment of trauma, and that really sort of cemented the fact that therapeutic relationship is important. And so then that's when I decided to go back and do my dissertation, because I felt that I'm here. This is why I'm here, because I feel that we needed to know this in our profession. And so we needed to basically understand it, define it, and say, what is it in physio? Because we'd been using or thinking about, at least in research, thinking about therapeutic relationship from the psychology literature. All right. And so it's like, well, does it apply here? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So the purpose of the study was to identify and describe the key components of the physiotherapy therapeutic relationship that were relevant and immediately applicable in the clinical environment. So that was a key piece of it. Really wanted the findings to be able to be integrated on some level in clinical practice. And so to answer that question, or to respond to that question, we use qualitative methodology. In terms of our team, it was a multidisciplinary team, or my committee was multidisciplinary. We had a lot of qualitative expertise on the team, and also, as I just said, in terms of what was informing or what I needed to consider be reflexive about within the project was my training and my experience as a physical therapist with a keen interest in therapeutic relationship. So we used interpretive description to respond to the research question, and the fact that we wanted it to be applicable in clinical practice. And because it's a clinical question. And so basically interpretive description is a framework that guides the design, or how you design your study. It's really useful to help think through and really consider and keep at the forefront clinical or applied problems. And as I said, it also helps ground one in the pragmatic versus becoming too theoretical in our findings. So we did the project in Edmonton, Canada, in private practice clinics. And so I'm not quite sure of the language in the UK, but private practice clinics are community clinics. They're not in hospital. In Alberta, anybody can access. You don't need a doctor's referral to access physical therapy. So you can walk into a community clinic, and access treatment. There's some government funding. There's workers' compensation. There's also insurance. So, or you could just simply pay privately if you choose. So that was our setting. We used purposive and convenience sampling, a physical therapist and adult patients. And so we had a fairly good mix of folks. And with the adult patients, we had folks that were more chronic, certainly in their presentation, or episodic. And also a good portion of them had previously accessed physical therapy. So one of our inclusion criteria, were that folks had received, I believe it was 3 months, 6 months. I should know this. It's been a while, but had received physical therapy within the previous, I think it was 3 to 6 months. But prior to that, 6 of 7 folks had also received physio. So they had a good sense of were able to compare and consider their different experiences within physical therapy. So data generation and analysis were iterative. So we used in-person semi-structured interviews and content analysis that I call it kind of a content analysis on steroids, because I really sort of didn't do a grounded theory, but really got into a more constant comparative perspective, I think more naturally, just because of my natural preferences. But did a lot of work memoing and really considering the data, and used various rigor strategies throughout the project. So before we get into the findings, I thought I'd just put out the strengths and limitations here. I know normally these come sort of at the end, but let's just get it over with. And so we can talk about the good stuff. The strengths were that, triangulation of data sources. Our physical therapists had significant clinical experience, and I considered that a strength because they were really able to speak to relationship and had a lot of different experiences to draw from. And as I said, most patients had experience with more than one care episode. And the limitations were that often participants' accounts were focused on the physiotherapy contributions and not necessarily the patient contributions to the relationship. And I didn't pull that out as much as an interviewer. Probably would do that a bit differently now. And also we excluded different settings like workers' compensation, and we focused on musculoskeletal people with musculoskeletal injuries or challenges, and didn't interview folks with other impairments and disabilities. So from that project, I developed a framework of the therapeutic relationship in physical therapy. And there are 3 key components of the therapeutic relationship in physical therapy that are pulled together through 3 overarching themes. So the 3 components are the conditions of engagement, which is what we're going to focus on today, that paper, the bond, and ways of establishing connections. And the key themes were that there was a mutuality to therapeutic relationship. Body was central for physical therapists in developing therapeutic relationship. And there was also a professional and a personal element to the process. And so, as I said, this presentation is a bit of a mashup because I'm talking about the big project and what we found in the big project, and then now we're gonna start to focus in on the manuscript about conditions. But before we do that, establishing meaningful connections. The 3 key themes within that were acknowledging the individual, using body as a pivot point, and giving of self. In terms of the ways that we can establish connections. And each one of those categories had subcategories as well to it. And the 4 elements of the bond, the rapport, respect, trust, and caring were key elements that came out within the analysis. But now we focus on the necessary conditions of engagement for the therapeutic relationship in physiotherapy. So the big objective was identifying those components, and then in responding to the conditions, it was really to identify and provide in-depth descriptions of the conditions of engagement necessary for a therapeutic relationship between physiotherapist and patient. So the conditions are the intentions and attitudes of physiotherapists and patients engaging in the clinical interaction. So the conditions came out, there are four conditions. And the idea of the conditions is that the intentions and the attitudes are how we are being in the interaction, right? It's not necessarily what we are doing, although it's related. They aren't separate, but it's how we are being. And so the way that I conceptualized and thought of the conditions and how they related to one another came in the form of a little box, right, or a container. And so the conditions are strategically placed on the container based on sort of their contribution to creating the container and their role. And so you can see being present is the bottom of the container. And so if you do not have a bottom of a container, you don't really have much holding it. And so being present is absolutely essential in terms of creating a safe container. Being receptive, size of the container. So once again, absolutely critical that we are receptive, and being present and being receptive feed into one another. So those are the two key conditions. But you can see on the top, being committed and being genuine form the lids. And so there's more mobility within the lids. And so being committed and being genuine, as you'll see when we kind of go into the conditions more in detail, that there's more variability in that, depending on your situation, depending on who you are as a person, depending on the relationship that you have or how you're getting along with the person that you're with. So there's just more variability in that scenario. So getting on, let's talk about the first condition, being present. So essentially being present, I found that was an individual's intent and ability to be and remain in the moment, in the here and now of the therapeutic interaction. And this is just some research that I pulled from, it came out relatively recently, 2019, a year after, from medicine. And they found a similar description. Basically, it's the purposeful intention to connect and the absence or opposite of distraction. So a key sort of example that struck me from patients' accounts of their relationships with therapists was that they noticed, or they could perceive, a difference between when a therapist was rushed and when a therapist was busy. And that patients respected that therapists were going to be busy. They respected it and they expected it. But there was tension when they perceived that a therapist was rushed. And as this patient said, they were busy as can be, just on a cycle, going from one to the next and coming back. But they always took the time to make you feel like you were a decent person. And so there's that sense of busyness, and yet the therapists that this person was involved with were able to ground themselves, be present with that person, and engage with them as a person in the moment. And that was this key to that sense of presence. And so now, when folks ask me, well, what is something I can do? A clinician, what can I do in clinical practice? One of the things that I'll say is figure out when you're rushed and when you're busy, and how you ground yourself to become grounded in that interaction, so that you're not coming off as being rushed. So being receptive, there are two types of receptivity. Focused receptivity is us being attentive to become really aware of verbal and nonverbal behaviors, right? And then there's an open attitude. So an open attitude is a clinician's ability, but also a patient's ability to suspend judgment and be willing to work together. So here are a couple of examples of focused receptivity. So being attentive to the situation and the person. So as I said, we actively consider, certainly more so as therapists, actively consider patients' verbal and nonverbal cues. So therapists talked about picking up emotional states or potential emotional states of patients when they noticed how patients were responding or reacting in their bodies. But also really paying attention to what their patients were saying about their lives. And where they were at. So remembering comments, documenting them in the chart, making sure that they brought them up again in the next session. So gauging, they could gauge where a person was at and what their interests were. So the second piece of receptivity is having an open attitude, right? And there are a couple of ways of sort of manifesting an open attitude within the clinical interaction. One way was making room for the story. So consciously, as therapists, opening up and coming in with an attitude and an intention of a willingness to listen or an intention of curiosity, right? And remaining in that sense of curiosity. The ability to know when you were judging and being able to suspend judgment. And one way that this came up was not discounting a patient's story. So not doing the, oh, but, or yeah, we've seen that before, and sort of thing. So it's really about just embracing what that person is telling you at face value. And also contacting parts of the story. So listening for salient cues or really things that strike you that a patient has said, and picking up on those things and acknowledging them in the interaction. There's also collaborating and negotiating in terms of facilitating an open attitude. So there needed to be a mutual openness to listening and to trying. So both patients and therapists needed to be willing to listen to one another and to collaborate with one another and to adjust the plan on the fly. And for therapists, there was also the sense of continually engaging the patient for their contribution, both within the interaction, but also it could be outside of the interaction as well. All right, so moving on, you can see here, we've gone through being present and receptive on the box. So those are the two pillars, right? The two big containers. Now we're getting into being committed and genuine, where there's a bit more flexibility with how this unfolds. So the definition of committed is an ethic of care that addresses the duty that clinicians have agreed to uphold as professionals, as well as the existential desire to be of service to another person in a way that substantively contributes to restoring some semblance of well-being in that person's life. So being committed, when therapists are committed and creating a safe container, we're being committed to understanding, right? So it's that intention and the attitude that we aren't necessarily satisfied with the generic response. And what I mean by that is that we're not, we really want to understand what this person is going through and really want to get a sense of what's happening with them, either physically, socially, psychologically, or how those are impacting one another. And so this physical therapist said, if a person has what we would call a chip on their shoulder, let's say, you try and find out what the chip is. I see it as a part of my job to get over that chip. If I can find out what brought it on, whatever, empathize, understand, right? So this particular therapist, I can see her right now. This particular therapist is basically saying, it's when things are easy, it's easy to be committed. But also when things maybe aren't as easy, right? When people come in and they have been gaslit or they haven't had good experiences with providers in the past, they may come in and not be so open to engaging. And so saying, hey, I'm not going to blame the patient. I'm going to take it upon myself to open up that space to empathize with what this person's going through. We also want to be committed to act. So when we're talking about being committed to act, patients really picked up when therapists were making an effort, right, to honor their best interest and to do whatever they could within their capacity to work for them, right? And so, for example, it was about going the extra mile. or one that this patient said, recognize that when therapists are committed, that they're doing the best to do the best that they can. So they picked that up. All right. So being genuine. Being genuine by definition is to be real or convey a sense of sincerity, of being in the moment in the relationship. So that's about being honest, being yourself, and investing in the personal. So being honest had two elements to it. It was about being transparent. So providing the necessary information that's needed. And that was went both ways. Therapists it was valued that therapists were honest or transparent with information, but also that patients were transparent with therapists as well, because therapists needed to be able to trust what patients were telling them was what they needed to hear, and being direct. So the way that we communicate, the tone and the manner of communication is clear, and it maybe forthright as well. So this sense of not beating around the bush, or having a sense of calmness and forthrightness with compassion, to be able to communicate with people, to be as honest as possible. Being yourself, it's almost self-explanatory, right? It's no facade. So we need to be, hopefully patients, but certainly therapists, we need to be who we are in terms of that, our enduring qualities and our values, and also respecting who we are in the moment, right? So for example, a therapist necessarily shouldn't be thinking they have to put on a face of being an extrovert when they are in fact, a little more introverted. Finally, investing in the personal, there's an interest in the person, so beyond the professional. So this varied, though, amongst therapists in terms of how comfortable they felt with investing in the personal, and knowing about their lives, but also disclosing about their lives. But certainly I remember one therapist saying, it's not fair that I'm asking patients about their lives and the intimate details of their situations, and that I'm not disclosing any part of myself to them as well. So it was interesting that therapists spoke about, there was it was surprising to me at the time, but what one therapist would think would be something very personal and something that they would disclose, others wouldn't do so. So some therapists would say, oh, family, if I talk about my kids, that's okay. But others are like, kids are off. Kids are, I don't talk about my kids. I'll talk about the music I like, but not about family. So in conclusion, conditions are the essence of what's required to have a meaningful therapeutic relationship. So we need to create that container. And therapists, even though it's mutual, therapists are responsible for taking lead in this regard. Creating a safe container will facilitate mutual engagement, and the conditions promote appropriate responses in the moment. So if we can be present and be honest with ourselves and be receptive and genuine, it's more likely that we're going to be able to respond in meaningful ways. Essentially, be the ground. So for therapists, be the ground. And I just had some just a couple of slides, some recent research that I've done, or that we're doing right now, in telerehab with injured workers and with long COVID. Even though it's not about the therapeutic relationship, it's about these other phenomenon. Therapeutic relationship is coming up with all the patients that we're interviewing. Okay, so it's coming up in the clinical interaction. It's coming up as a part of a system, and how they feel supported and in relationship within the system, and also ruptures and tensions are coming up as well. And along that line, collaborations that are really coming up in my world are collaborations around exploring ruptures. So these are just writing collaborations that I've done, not specific research, but really focusing on practical insights. So with ruptures, with person-centered care, placebo and nocebo, and with communication, but more specifically, that sort of reflective and mindfulness, and how as clinicians we can be better clinicians and better communicators if we embrace mindfulness and reflection. And that's it. And I jibber jabbered way too much, but I didn't practice. I went into this cold, relatively, other than knowing the content, but I didn't rehearse. So I hope I didn't take too long.
No, you were absolutely brilliant, Maxi. Thank you so much. Let me just stop the recording so we can